Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us for today's IRB forum. We're really happy that you're able to be here. We've got some really interesting topics to cover. So as you probably know from the announcement, we're going to be talking about open access data banks and then single IRB submissions. And we're going to go ahead and start with Dr. Iafrate. He's the IRB 01 chair, and he's going to be talking about open access data banks. So we'll hear from both of the speakers, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. But for right now, welcome Dr. Iafrate, and thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks everybody. This shouldn't take very long. I just wanted to go through something that we initiated here that may help some of you. And I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully you see the slides. Is that right, Lauren?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, so Open Access Research Data Bank. What is that? Well, let me take you, let me set the stage first, and then I can answer questions in a few minutes. So if you remember, for research, a human subject is someone that is living and about whom an investigator obtains either data through intervention or interaction with that individual. In other words, you're doing something to them or with them, or with their identifiable private information, which, as you know, would be basically stuff that comes out of their medical record. However, if the data you're doing your research on is anonymous or has been de-identified, and that's what you're doing your research on, it may be considered to be non-human research. And again, the human definition is what's up above. So it's not that it didn't come from a human, but it's not a research definition of human. If it is anonymous, then nobody knows who the data belongs to. If it's de-identified, then de-identified means the 18 HIPAA identifiers, which are all here and include down at the bottom procedure dates and zip codes, because that would be a limited data set, not a de-identified data set. So if all those 18 HIPAA identifiers are not there, or either were never there because it's anonymous, or whether somebody has de-identified it, then it might be considered to be non-human research. Now, as you also know, that we require you to submit for a tissue or data bank, or tissue and data bank, if you're going to use that tissue or data for future research. So it's not just us, but the federal regulations require a research bank to be set up. Okay, now when you do research where the bank is the source of the data for the new protocol, again, if all you receive is de-identified data, then the study is submitted and approved as non-human. Now, the UFIRB is required to confirm if it's non-human, because we can tell you that many of the ones that are submitted are not non-human. Now, we may coach you on making it non-human, but a lot don't come into us as non-human, even though that's what was selected. So, so again, what I'm sort of painting the picture on is the current state of data banks that, in which, if you're doing research off of that bank, even if it's de-identified data, you have to submit it to the IRB as potentially a non-human subject's request. So what is an open access research database? That is, again, something that's here at the University of Florida. So a research data bank that's under the jurisdiction of the UF Health Honest Brokers, also known as the IDR staff, that has submitted basically a de-identified data set to us, and we've determined that it's non-human, then here's the key point, that if subsequent research where the data only comes out of those open access databases does not require IRB approval. So again, if you, and I'll explain that in a little bit more right now. So which research data banks has the IRB approved as open access banks? The first one is, some of you, if this doesn't make sense to you, then it's probably not relevant to you, but you can go on to I2B2, which is a software program, and you can query the integrated data repository. It was set up to allow you to determine how many people might fit a particular research protocol you want to do. So you go into I2B2, you basically construct a query, kids who have renal transplants and are hypertensive. You can pull all that information down, hit a button, and it will tell you how many people in the health system fit that criteria. But you can also get de-identified data about the gender, you can get lab results, things like that, all through this query, but they come to you de-identified. So if you do research in which the source of the research is only the answers that you get when you do an I2B2 query, then those don't need to be submitted to the IRB. So we recently had one where someone looked at patients in the system, their vitamin D levels, and whether they became COVID positive or not, and actually published a paper on that. Well, that all happened without any pre-IRB approval. The other currently approved open access database was submitted by Chris Harley. Again, he's the person who oversees the Honest Broker Group. And it was basically a de-identified data set of clinical data from COVID-19 positive patients. So what type of research is conducted using these types of, these two databases? Typically, as you might expect, secondary analysis research, evaluating standards of care, pragmatic health care analysis, chart review kind of stuff. Can data from another source be added to the data that you get from one of these open access databases? Well, to qualify for no IRB review, all the data you use for the new study has to come from one of those two open access databases. So if you want to add data from some other source to the data you get from this open access database, that's fine. You would just need IRB approval. What do you tell a journal when they ask for documentation of IRB approval? Well, if you go to our Investigator Guidelines and you go to this topic of open access databases, it'll give you some suggested language you can tell them. However, if they are stubborn, and many are, and they want a letter from me, then you contact me. I'll need a copy of what it is you're submitting to the journal. And if it looks like it all came from these open access databases, then I'll provide you a signed form letter that you can provide to the journal. And that's it. So there may be questions. So I don't know how you handle these questions, Lauren.
If anybody has questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can, put them in the chat. That's probably the best option right now.
Okay, I'm gonna change my camera. They have two screens and the slide presentation comes up on the other one. So that was perfectly clear, or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, it's not related to anything anybody does, which is fine. It's just an option. It is a way to do research without IRB approval. I thought I would get like tons of fanfare and clapping, but apparently not. Okay. Well, I'll let Ivana present her part. I got one clap.
We do have a question.
I'm sorry?
Real quick. It looks like we do have a question real quick.
Okay.
I'm going to unmute you.
Is I2B2 the same as the IDR? Well, so the integrated data repository is a grouping of a whole bunch of data, like, I mean, terabytes of data that UF and SHANS uses to do daily work, pay bills, report things, do quality efforts, and so on. Once a month, a limited data set is pulled from the IDR and put into I2B2, which is an electronic querying software. And so they're not, so it depends on your point of view whether they're the same thing or different. One comes from the other and has a limited data set out of the IDR. Hopefully that didn't confuse you more.
So Chris, typically when you do chart reviews, you would go to IDR, and that's different from what we're talking about now.
Well, I'll be listening to Ivana's talk for a little while. I have another Zoom at 1, so I may cut off, but if any other questions come up. Okay, Chris said if you get data from IDR, do you need a confidentiality agreement? It depends on if you're getting, well, no, because
Dr. Iafrate, I'm sorry, this is Renee.
Yeah.
Yes, we've answered this question before. The IDR always keeps a code. So if you're getting it from the IDR, it's coded.
Okay, all right. Yeah, because that's true. They want to go back in case you have other questions. So they serve as the honest broker, which is the person between identifiable information and a de-identified information or a limited data set. I know, it is a different language. It's the way of the world. So again, I'll let Ivana go ahead and I'll hang around in case there's any other last minute questions.
And everyone is welcome to ask questions at the end on either topic, so don't feel like you have to time it right. And I'm going to share my screen. Although there is nothing simple about single IRB, the title of this talk is Single IRB Made Simple. So maybe I'm over advertising this and you may be disappointed in the end. But the goal for today is really to talk about the two sides of the single IRB, namely the seeding of review and the arrangement where UF serves as a single IRB for multi-site research. I will talk about eligibility conditions, the process on both ends of the coin, and so on. But most importantly, I'd like to hear from you, because now we as an institution, you as researchers and research coordinators, and we as the IRB have rich experience in the single IRB domain. We have developed many relationships with institutions that we work with. Institutions have adjusted to the new regulatory requirements and collaborate better than they used to. So I would like to hear from you about your experiences and what you would like to know on top of what I'm going to present. Some of this information might be already familiar to you, but I will nonetheless start from the very beginning. So what does it mean to seed review to a single IRB? That's an institution relying on a single IRB of record for regulatory oversight of the studies. So when UF is seeding review to another IRB, we are not reviewing the study in the sense of providing regulatory review and oversight. We are only reviewing for the local context matters, and these include state laws, local ancillary reviews, and institutional rules and policies. And regulations do require documenting reliance. Reliance can be documented in a number of ways, but the most popular way amongst the institutions is to document it by using IRB authorization agreement, or IAA for short. An IAA is a legal document between institutions that have an FWA that documents and specifies the terms of reliance between the institutions. Now, single IRB has been with us, that has always been a concept, obviously, but it became widely popular with NIH's single IRB policy that was in effect since January 25th, 2018, and it applies to domestic sites of NIH-funded multi-site studies where each site conducts the same protocol involving non-exempt human subject research. So all the conditions for the single IRB requirement are spelled in this statement. Now, the requirement doesn't apply to studies or to projects approved before the effective date, but it does affect competitive renewals. Shortly after, Common Rule was revised, and single IRB requirement came into effect a little bit later than the revised Common Rule. So the compliance date was January 20th, 2020. And the single IRB requirement that Common Rule imposes is slightly broader than NIH's requirement. So any institution located in the United States that is engaged in cooperative research must rely upon approval by a single IRB for that portion of the research that is conducted in the United States. Still, the requirement doesn't apply to exempt research. And that there are some exceptions that are largely determined by the funding departments and agencies supporting or conducting the research. And they may choose to require or not require single IRB review. So NIH has some exceptions, and there are some other funding agencies that have exceptions. And recently there were some exceptions in relation to COVID research. Another term that's of interest here is Smart IRB IAA. Although it sounds silly to say at this point in time, but Smart IRB is not an IRB. It's a collaborative platform funded by NIH in the effort of facilitating single IRB requirements. So Smart IRB IAA is a master reliance agreement. It's a common non-negotiable master agreement. And so the virtue of that agreement is that anytime institutions try to establish reliance, they don't have to depend on their general counsels and their turnaround times. The terms of this agreement are pre-agreed upon. And the only thing that institutions have to pay attention to are study-specific checklists, flexibility agreements that may or may not need to go through general counsel. Typically not, but then there are sometimes some flexibility agreements that might need general counsel input. Now, UF is a Smart IRB IAA user, along with some 800 participating institutions. However, we are not using their tracking system, which is a web platform for tracking reliance. We have My IRB that tracks reliance, so we don't have to depend on that. And institutions widely differ whether they use it or not. Now, the single IRB of the record determines which IAA will be used for the study. So, for example, if UF is a single IRB, we will mostly use a Smart IRB IAA unless there's some circumstance that would require us to use our master agreement that was in play before Smart IAA was widely accepted. So are there any questions so far about the preliminary terms and the setup? Okay. If not, I'll move on to seeding review to a single IRB and what UF process looks like. Well, first of all, I'd like to specify what research is eligible for seeding to single IRB. We have an investigator guideline that addresses this topic, that's very action guiding and answers most of the questions that people have about seeding review to single IRB of record. So when somebody calls me and says, I'd like to seed a study, how do I do it? I typically ask them to make a step back and tell me a little bit about the study, namely the funding status of the study and the kind of a study, because if the study is exempt or international, single IRB wouldn't even be in place, so we wouldn't have that conversation. So going back to the eligibility criteria for seeding study to an external sIRB of record, studies for which use of a single IRB is required by the sponsor or funding agency for participation in the study would be the first criterion. And then any domestic, multi-site, or collaborative non-exempt research studies. Now, UF will consider seeding review to a single IRB for a study meeting the above criteria, provided that the IRB that's proposed to be the single IRB in question has sufficient standards of review. So as part of our local context review, we'll look into the profile of a single IRB that's proposed. And we are an institution with the high standards of compliance, as evidenced by our AHRP accreditation. AHRP, as most of you are familiar with, is a nonprofit organization that cultivates compliance culture among the participating institutions and serves the purpose of improving that at each participating institution. So we are AHRP accredited, and we consider that any other institution that's AHRP accredited has sufficient standards of review, or if not AHRP accredited, we would confirm through looking over documents of interest that the institution has standards equivalent to those that are AHRP accredited. So again, the takeaway from this, what matters for eligibility is funding status of the study, and then that the study is not international, it has to be obviously multi-site and non-exempt. Now, what studies are not eligible for seeding to a single IRB? Obviously, as I mentioned, exempt studies, which includes chart reviews and non-human studies. Industry or other non-federally funded studies where sponsor does not require a single IRB review. And I will go back to that in a little while. Research on UF student athletes, research involving the Alachua County school system. And by the way, these are institutional standards rather than the IRB standards per se. Research involving fetal tissue and embryonic stem cells, review of proposed community consultation plan for studies involving exception from informed consent. Research studies proposing to defer IRB oversight to an IRB that is not sufficiently qualified. So that will be an institution that's either not AHRP accredited, or if AHRP accredited, if they had some OHRP citations recently or some issue that would really raise a concern on our end. What about commercial IRBs? We predominantly use two commercial IRBs, WIRB, with which we have a long-standing relationship that goes back to the 90s, and Addendum. Now, institutional policy on using commercial IRBs is pretty clear. So we have with WIRB two tracks. One track is for industry authored or sponsored FDA regulated trials from College of Medicine faculty, which directly go to WIRB without having any kind of submission to the UF IRB. And this is done under our master service agreement from 1990s with WIRB. Now, federally funded studies are seeded to WIRB under SMART IAA, and that does require a local submission. That's a completely different process, and a local seeded submission is required for that. And then when you go to WIRB to submit a request to add UF as a site, they would be looking for the acknowledgement letter that the local context review has been completed at UF. For Advara, we have the studies that would typically go to Advara would be industry-sponsored studies where the sponsor requires a single IRB review. And these studies would be seeded to Advara or WIRP by using SMART IAA. Documentation about the sponsor requirement, however, is required with your seeded submission, and it will be uploaded on miscellaneous attachments in on the SMART forms in My IRB, and that would document that sponsor requirement for using the single IRB, which in effect would be grounds for granting an exception to the institutional policy about the use of commercial IRBs. As far as the nitty-gritty of the seeding process at UF, I'm just going to give you steps through the SMART forms. So seeded project type is a separate workflow from creating and submitting a new study in My IRB. Seeded studies even have different nomenclature that start with CED and then the study number. SMART forms have only rudimentary branching. We have removed most of the branching because, as I said in the beginning, we are not providing regulatory review and oversight. We are only doing the local context review. So the seeded path really serves the purpose of getting the basic information about the study to be able to conduct that local context review and to be able to ping the ancillaries. What we typically, a lot of institutions use SMART IAA. However, if an IAA has to be negotiated, that's also a way to put it into the system. You would create a seeded study and then upload the IAA that then we would route for review and signatures. The SMART forms that are in this truncated path are familiar, except one new SMART form. It's IRB of record site for seeded review. Now on that page, we ask you to provide the overall PI's name, the overall coordinator's name, IRB contact information. We ask a little bit about that IRB, whether they're AHARP accredited, to give us their website so we can look at their roster and so on. On that page, we also ask you to upload any IAAs, unless it's a SMART IAA. In that case, all we need on that page are study-specific reliance documents that typically involve flexibility agreements, different local context checklists, in general, study-specific documents that that institutional official or his designee have to sign off on in order for the institution to seed review. And of course, we would need the approval letter for the overall study from the IRB of record. So in essence, a prerequisite for submitting a seeded study at UF is that the overall study has been approved by the IRB of record, unless you have to put an IAA through the system for negotiation. All right. Along with these documents, you will be also submitting the informed consent template that comes from the IRB of record. These consents come in a couple flavors. The most common flavor is that you get a consent, and then highlighted are the sections where we can update the local context information. Study teams update the local PI's contact information, subject cost and injury language, if there's radiation, PERC language, and other ancillary language that would go into the consent. And just make a note that the process for seeded studies is slightly different. On regular studies, UF IRB staff would insert that language for you, and before we would stamp the consent. Since we are not stamping the consent, since we are not approving it by not being the IRB of record, we will not be doing that for you, but that will be something that you would be doing upfront. Another flavor in which these consents could come, if you don't have an editable consent, there could be a core consent and an addendum. That's actually a model that UF uses. I think Johns Hopkins uses this model, where in the core consent, the basic information about the study is captured and it cannot be modified, but then local sites can modify informed consent addenda where the local context information such as subject cost and injury language are captured, payments, radiation language if applicable, and so on are captured. Now, when our local context review is done and when all ancillaries are approved, the study is acknowledged and goes into a state of awaiting site materials, which means that we are now waiting for the IRB of record to add and approve UF as a site. Well, that means that the UF PI needs to submit that acknowledgement letter to the overall PI, who then initiates a revision at the IRB of record to add UF as a site. Of course, in the case of commercial IRBs, the team from here would go then to the commercial IRB without the mediation of the overall PI. Now, once revision to add UF as a site is approved, the coordinator or the PI for the study would submit IRB of record correspondence, which is an activity in MyIRB where you attach the approval letter that UF has been approved as a site, and then you attach all same documents such as informed consent, any recruitment materials, anything that needed single IRB's approval in relation to UF as a site. There's one small caveat here. There are some institutions that do not stamp consents. NCI is one of them. I don't know many, but NCI is a sort of a good example where the consent that's approved is not actually stamped. Now, once the documents are submitted to us, we approve seeding of the study. What we are in fact approving is that a study can start at UF. Now, there is obviously there is a scenario where when a revision is submitted, I'm going to kind of introduce a little complication here, so you're aware of this as well. It could be that once the study is acknowledged here, and suppose we propose the subject cost and injury language, and that goes to the IRB of record, and they're unhappy about it for some reason, they could send some correspondence other than approval, which would also be submitted to us by using the same activity, submit IRB of record correspondence. Suppose they have some objection to the consent. They want you to add or subtract something, or something is not right with other documents. So that would be submitted via this activity as well. And then we would, again, route it to the ancillaries for consultation and further review. But eventually, once all issues are resolved, by using this activity, you would submit final approved documents. Now, what about relying principal investigators' responsibilities and study team's responsibilities? Well, they increase by order of magnitude. Why? Because not only that you have to keep up with your local IRB and institutional requirements, but now you have to keep up with another IRB's requirements. So there are increased responsibilities that our local PI and study team have. And that's something that's underappreciated, I think. Single IRB has been advertised as a way to streamline IRB review. And that may or may not be correct, because by streamlining IRB review, we still haven't addressed the notion of study activation that depends on ancillary reviews. And ancillary reviews are looped through the IRB still. So, but regardless of that, the idea here is that the UFPI has to keep up with the reporting requirements for the local IRB and the institution and the reviewing single IRB. The PI has to stay up to date with the IRB of records determinations and communications. The local PI has to communicate what the local institution or the IRB have determined to the IRB of record as well. And of course, the local principal investigators and study teams have to stay cognizant of the fact that although the local IRB doesn't have regulatory oversight over the study, the local rules still apply. So for example, if cold calling is not an allowed recruitment method at UF, despite the fact that the study has been seeded, that doesn't make it okay to apply that recruitment strategy here. And actually most reviewing IRBs are sensitive to that fact. So as part of the local context questionnaire, they do ask, what is okay with your institution in terms of recruitment? Are cold calls allowed? Is partial HIPAA waiver required? And so on. So all that goes into the local context review. Okay, now, so let's now shift gears and say, okay, let's say a seeded study has been approved and can start at UF. What now? What are post-approval responsibilities? Well, what about revisions? Regulations state that all revisions, no matter how minor, have to be reviewed by an IRB. But of course, they have to be reviewed by a single IRB that has regulatory oversight of the study. The revisions that UF would care to see would only be the revisions that involve changes in the local context or some changes that require pinging an ancillary review or something that has to do with the local state laws. And we actually have a very helpful set of questions in my IRB on the revision application smart form that teases out what would be the relevant changes that would require a local submission. And so if the answer to N is none of the above to all these questions, and just as an example, I'll list few: change in PI, addition in change in the location where the study procedures will be performed, changes in funding, pregnancy testing for minors that is not standard of care. All these would be examples that of changes that would require a local submission, because those are locally relevant matters. However, if none of these items are listed as changes, then a revision wouldn't be submitted. And I know that came as a surprise to many of you, because we would have a situation where consent would be modified and we would not see that revision unless a local ancillary review is required. And again, the explanation is that we are not reviewing and approving the consent. It's the single IRB of record that's doing that, and we have ceded review to it. As far as continuing reviews go, for expedited studies, continuing review is not in play anymore for most institutions. Now, what we need to see is just the current protocol, informed consent, and approval letter from the IRB of record. And so the approval time at CR will be driven by the IRB of record. So if it's an expedited study and regulations don't require continuing review, if the institution has a 3-year check-in period, then that will be 3 years, and it will be CR. It is some kind of equivalent of that. If the institution said 1 year, we would put 1 year. As far as reportable events go, we require only serious or continuing local non-compliance to be reported, or local unanticipated problems or adverse events that are serious, unexpected, and related, or was more likely than not related to the study intervention and subject participation in the study. So this is the end of the seeding process at UF. Before I move to UF serving as a single IRB, I'll take a little moment to take any questions and clarify anything if needed, or start a discussion if that's appropriate.
All right, do we have any questions?
Doesn't look like it, so I'll just keep pressing.
I do have a question.
Yes.
I've just done my first seeded study to Advara, and one of the problems that we've run into, or at least the complications we run into, is it's a platform study. So the medications on the study keep changing. We just got the authorization to seed. We put the application into the central IRB. But since that time, 2 new study medications have been added, which creates changes in the ICF, and I'm assuming required changes in the FLA. What is my next step?
Your next step would be submitting a revision so that OCR can be triggered and the consent can be adjusted. So this would be a perfect example of a study that would require a local revision because OCR's review is needed. So again, it's not an IRB issue, but ancillary review, institutional ancillary review is looped through the IRB. So we would be getting the revision for it. And most institutions actually do leverage local IRB offices for institutional ancillary review. So it's not atypical to do that. But again, the IRB is not reviewing and approving the consent. We are only looking at the relevant local context matters. And in this case, it's really just to ping OCR to produce a new FLA, and that FLA is verified in the new consent.
Thank you.
Yes, and adaptive trials have many challenges, so I'm not surprised that you will have your hands full. There are regulatory and ethical challenges with them, and of course, administrative.
Yeah, they're fun, lots of fun.
So we have a couple other questions. Is there a push to use IRBs like WIRB for all single IRB studies?
I didn't actually, is there a push to use IRBs like WIRB for all single IRB studies? The question is a little bit broad. I don't know, push from whom? The push would, typically the funding agency or the sponsor determine which IRB is going to be used. I don't feel the push. and I don't hear from anyone any particular push. But generally, sponsors do like the single IRB idea because the initial motivation for the single IRB was predicated on the premise that the IRB review time would be streamlined. And as now we are seeing, that premise may or may not have been correct, because we have streamlined the IRB review, but the ancillary review is now what's sometimes holding up the study activation. And different institutions have different ancillary reviews. And so harmonizing in that domain is one of the major topics amongst the institutions in the single IRB conversation.
Well, my question was kind of pertained to, you know, how UF for industry studies use SIRB as a central IRB, because most of those are multi-site studies versus where some of these where we're seeding to another IRB may be more of another institution's IRB. So I didn't know if there was a push to kind of take it out of the institutions into a third-party IRB, or if it's...
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. No. I think academic institutions serve as single IRBs. In fact, some academic institutions have, as part of their business model, they provide single IRB services to investigators who are not even part of their institution, and they charge for it.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right, we have another question. How does IREX play into this process?
Well, IREX is just a tracking platform that's supposed to be a common playground where you can document and track reliance. But as I said, we have my IRB, so we don't really use external tracking systems for that. And the majority of institutions do not participate. There are some that do, but a lot of them do not. But IREX doesn't in any way contribute to the speed of executing reliance. It's just another way of documenting it and tracking it.
All right, are there any more questions?
And I guess I should take this opportunity to point out, although we don't use IREX or smart IRB platform for documenting and tracking reliance, out of courtesy to other institutions that might, if we need to click the box, we agree to seed review, we will do that. We have a login and we will execute that, but that will be predicated on there being executed paperwork that's the basis for doing that. I hope that helps. All right, I see one more question, I think. Yes, I like the comment. Yes, the commercial IRBs would love the push towards them. All right, so now we're switching gears, and this is the other side of the coin. Now I'm going to talk about not UF seeding review to an external single IRB of records, either commercial or academic, but this is a scenario where UF is serving as a single IRB for multi-center research. I'm happy to acknowledge that we have lots of experience with doing this. We in fact have, I think we are a leader in this domain. That most institutions, when the single IRB requirement was introduced, were limiting themselves to serving as a single IRB for no more than 10 sites. That was a limit that I heard nationally. Well, at that time, we had two single IRB studies with more than 35 and 50 sites respectively. And the study that initially started as a 50-site study has grown into a 100-site study. And then we have a few dozen other single IRB studies that we are the reviewing IRB for. We have reorganized in this domain. We have a single IRB specialist who is perhaps here today, Alison Fons. She has been instrumental in negotiating with other institutions the process, in helping our investigators onboard sites and relate our requirements for what needs to be submitted to these sites and approve them here at UF. And of course, she has been instrumental in on the seeding end as well, when we need to reach out to other IRBs and better understand their institutional requirements in order to be able to meet them efficiently so that research can start sooner rather than later. So here is the initial process. So when we have collaborated with our friends from DSP to get a report every time a multi-center study that's says yes to human research is when any proposal is submitted, and especially when it's awarded, we get a little email that says this is happening, and that gives us a little insight what's coming our way, because sometimes people forget to engage the IRB until it's a crisis. So in order to be proactive, we have instituted this, and so when we get that email, we reach out to the PI if we haven't met with them already, and we relay to them the requirement that the PI meets with the IRB reliance team so that we can start the planning phase. We have our intake form on our IRB website for all those who are familiar, great. If not, if you go to our main website, there is a UF single IRB tab where you can fill out the request to meet with the reliance team. The reliance team meets on Tuesdays, 8:30 to 11. And when we have somebody proposing a single IRB study where we are the IRB of record, we first discuss the IAA status with the participating institutions, because the IAA used to be the limiting step because it used to take so long to negotiate agreements. With a smart IAA, that step has been made very short and efficient. Now, the reliance team sets parameters with the PI and the study team. We explained that the study team is the link and the cohesive glue between us and the relying sites. The team must be experienced and highly organized and have systems in place for reporting events, ensuring that continuing review is submitted in time, because if the study expires here, it expires for all sites. Nobody can do anything. Because remember, the single IRB has the regulatory oversight for the study. And of course, the PI responsibilities grow exponentially because PI is responsible for all sites. And the PI is the communication hub. So when we try to set up parameters, we really drill in on the communication plan that's typically submitted as part of the protocol for any single IRB study, and it's evaluated. As far as the process for approving single IRB study at UF, the submission process is standard. So you use the same project type that you would use to create any new study. The nomenclature is the same. We initially approve a single IRB study, but we approve it without any sites, because in order for relying sites to be able to seed review and for their institutions to sign off on seeding, they have to have a final product, approved protocol to sign off on. So the study has to be approved by the single IRB first. And of course, with that approval comes UF as a site that's built in. Now, after the study is approved, then the reliance is established with relying sites, and then they're added, the site onboarding, it goes through revisions. What we require from sites is the so-called Exhibit C, or Smart Acknowledgement document, which is a study-specific document that captures information about study demographic, PI information, relying PI information, and then we ask some local context questions and require certification from the relying IRB that the local context has been completed at their institution, and they commit to seed study to UF. Once we have that, and once we have approved local addendum for that site, we are in a position to onboard that site and approve it as a participating site. About a year ago, we have implemented in my IRB a new project type, revisions to add P sites. What's really beautiful about this is that with this addition, we were able to facilitate ongoing revision of a parent study while sites are being onboarded. Because as you know, two revisions cannot be played at the same time, just like continuing reviews and revisions cannot be in play at the same time in my IRB. However, revisions, we have leveraged the functionality in my IRB that allows for the so-called light revisions. It's a really rudimentary path that allows you to give us site information such as the PI name and coordinator name and contact information, and the local IRB contact information, namely the relying IRB's contact information. And they're able to attach Exhibit C, or Smart Acknowledgement document, along with the informed consent addendum. That's it. That's all to it. That's all there is to that project type. Once we get that, although the study itself might be a full board study, onboarding of sites is always run via executive review procedure or expedited review procedure. So a chair, a vice chair, a looks at that and signs off, so that doesn't take a lot of time. I can't think of a circumstance where a site onboarding could go to full board if something major changes in the study along with adding of that site that affects the risk. That's a conceivable scenario, but very unlikely, of course. Now, all as far as the post-approval world and cycle of the study, all revisions and continuing reviews are approved by the UF IRB because, again, we have the regulatory oversight. And the overall PI is responsible, and the PI's team is responsible for providing a copy of the IRB approval letter and any applicable documents to the relying PI and the relying site. We typically advise teams how to do this when they meet with the Reliance team. We have a little spiel we give them. Dropbox and a listserv are a very efficient way of covering this domain, but there are other ways, so long as and again, this is where the communication plan gets implemented in these situations. What's of essence here is to be very careful about planning your CRs in relation to your revisions. The caveat here, although a revision to add a site and a main revision can be in play at the same time, a revision to add a P site or a revision cannot be in play at the same time as continuing review. So you have to be very strategic about when your continuing review deadline is. I recommend that you set your internal deadline far before the actual deadline. We send you a first notification about study expiration 90 days before it expires. That's your time when you really need to act and get things going. Now, the main PI at UF submits reportable events received by the relying sites per our reporting policy. And of course, any determinations that are made here, including corrective action plans, will have to be communicated back to the relying sites. Now, this was a long talk, a lot of information was covered. So now turn it to you with any remaining questions. And I have some resources here, again, also including human resources. Alison Fons is a great resource, so her contact information is here. And then we have some of our website resources as well. Any questions either about open access data banks or single IRB? And yes, we will make these presentations available on our website. We have a little news feed that will post this.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions? All right, doesn't look like it. Well, thank you, Dr. Iafrate. Thank you, Dr. Simic, for being here and sharing this information with us. We will be posting this on the website as stated, and thank you all for joining us very much. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you all for attending.